If you love to lift heavy and roll hard, but you're still doing one of these 5 things, you're slowing yourself down. You're not getting stronger, you're not getting more athletic, and you're actually increasing your risk of injury both in the gym and on the mat. These are habits and mistakes that I see all the time. Guys want to get better, they want to be a more dangerous and more effective grappling athlete, yet they're still making these mistakes in the gym, and it's really costing them not just in training, but also in competition. In this episode, I'm not just going to highlight each mistake, but I'm going to give you practical steps and tools that you can use to fix these mistakes to make faster and longer lasting progress. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Settlage Strength podcast. We are on episode 10, which is crazy because I think my good friend, my boy, Andrew Zaragoza, he's been helping me a ton in this podcast process, and he told me a really interesting stat. He said that if you make it past 10, or if you make it to your 10th podcast episode, you're already in the top 1% of podcasts in the entire world. So I feel pretty good the fact that we're making it here to episode 10. You guys are still listening. The Lift Heavy Roll Hard Grappling Club is still growing very, very fast, which is amazing to see. And so in today's episode, we're really going to be talking about the 5 mistakes that I see grapplers most commonly make in the gym. You guys have heard me talk about how the number one thing you can do off the mat to improve your performance on the mat is going to be to get stronger, get more explosive, build muscle, improve your conditioning. All this stuff that we do in the gym has huge benefits for how we perform and ultimately how we protect ourselves or decrease our risk of injury on the mat. However, there are still some common mistakes that I see a lot of grappling athletes make that is holding them back from being able to feel and perform their best. And that first mistake that I'm going to talk about is chasing soreness over progression. And you can kind of interchange soreness with anything that is not as important as just overall progression. But soreness is often the most common. And what I see is that sometimes people get really fired up and really excited. They're like, man, I'm all about lifting heavy. I'm all about rolling hard. I'm going to go hit the gym, start lifting some heavy ass weights, start, pumping some iron and all that good stuff. Yet they're chasing the wrong metrics or they're chasing the wrong outcomes. And that's not to say that chasing getting sore is always a bad thing. However, it can come at the cost of you being able to get the most out of your jiu-jitsu training at the same time. And so one thing that I'm a big fan of is it's a quote by a powerlifter named Matt Winning, and I've also heard Stan Efferding talk about this too. They talk about your training sessions are designed or should be designed to stimulate, not annihilate. Now, what do we mean by that? We really want to have that workout, whether you're doing max effort squats, dynamic effort, upper body work, whether you're doing some jacked and tan training where you're just trying to build and pack on some muscle, or even if, say, you're doing some interval training, working on conditioning. All those training sessions should be designed to stimulate positive growth, to stimulate positive progress, but none of those training sessions should be so intense or so long or so difficult that it annihilates your body to where you can't have a good jiu-jitsu training session later that day or later in the week. And oftentimes it can be hard to know if you're making progress because, we do a workout, we get really sore, and there's this weird like pleasure in the pain of being sore. And I know I still feel that way. Like sometimes I'll have these conversations with my training partners where we'll ask each other, like, what's your favorite body part to have just be completely obliterated and sore? And someone might say, like, man, when my chest is super sore, that's the best feeling ever. I just know like I'm growing some big pecs. For me, it's my back. If my back is sore, like every time I puff my chest out and stretch and squeeze my back together, if that feels sore, I'm thinking like, man, like I just crushed that training session. And though soreness is a byproduct of hard training, soreness can be a side effect of a really, really good training session that shouldn't be the only thing that we're focusing on when we're going to the gym. It's almost like the idea of just getting sweaty. You can get sweaty. That doesn't mean that you're making positive progress. you can go to jiu-jitsu and you may think like, man, I just want to go in there and work up a sweat and get really good at jiu-jitsu. So you might get completely smashed. Like everybody passed your guard. Everybody crushed you and smother tapped you in mount. And you might leave the training session saying like, man, I did really good today. I'm super sweaty. When that's not really the case. Like, yeah, you got sweaty. That doesn't necessarily mean you had a productive jiu-jitsu training session. Soreness can also be kind of looked at the same way, where if you go to the gym with the only measure of whether or not that was a good training session is if you're sore the next day, okay, yeah, you're sore. You did enough work in the gym to create a lot of muscle damage and stimulate some need for recovery, but that doesn't mean you're making the most amount of progress possible. So some things that I like to look at when it comes to what is like the marker of a good training session is, for me personally, I like to make sure that I like to make sure that I leave the gym feeling better than when I walked in every time. And that's something that I picked up from a good friend and mentor, Mark Bell. He's often talked about how the gym should be something that always leaves you better than when you walked in. That doesn't mean that you feel like you have more energy or you should not be tired when you leave the gym. Sometimes that happens. Like you do some really hard conditioning intervals, you're going to be pretty winded afterwards, and that's okay. But you should always feel much better when you leave the gym than when you walk in. So if tonight I got some hard jiu-jitsu sparring and I'm going to go to the gym tomorrow morning. If I show up tomorrow morning and I'm feeling kind of tight and a little banged up from the sparring I did, the previous night, when I leave the gym, I should feel better in the sense that I don't feel as tight, I don't feel as banged up. If I go into the gym already feeling tight and banged up and I decide, you know what, I'm just going to smash myself down even further. I'm going to do sets of 20 on back squats. I'm going to do some Tom Platt style drop sets on leg extensions and just completely obliterate myself. That's cool, but that may not be the best thing for me, especially if I'm trying to find the best balance of lifting heavy and rolling hard. So if you just follow that rule of, okay, when I go into the gym, I want to make sure I leave feeling better than when I walked in. The other thing that's important, at least for me when I go to the gym, is try not to ever miss lifts in the gym. I try as hard as possible to never miss a lift unless it's at the end of like a really, really long, maybe 6 months of training where I've been trying to build up towards a certain PR and I'm going to send it and go for that big PR. Outside of that, I really try not to miss that many lifts. And sometimes my ego still gets the best of me and I miss some lifts. But the way I look at it is that you don't really make much progress off of the lifts that you miss or the lifts that you fail. So if you're doing it, max effort floor press, working up to a 3-rep max, say your all-time best is 225 for a triple. Not bad, especially if you're, under 180 pounds. And you hit 225 for a triple, and you're like, dang, that actually felt pretty easy. I just matched my old PR. I'm going to go for another PR. So say you throw 5 pounds on each side, you bump the weight up to 235. And it's tough, but you still get that 235-pound PR. You're like, dang, this is freaking awesome. Hit a 10-pound PR. I'm feeling great. Typically, when I see that happen in the gym with some of the athletes that I coach, I cut them off right there. I say like, hey, you just hit this win, take your PR, and move on. Like, this is a great stimulus for your body. You're stimulating great strength gains, and you crushed it. So, like, let's be happy with this and move on. And sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say like, you know what, I think I got one more. So they add 5 more pounds on each side, they bump up to 245, and then they miss the lift. It doesn't always happen, but oftentimes it happens. And if they miss the lift, it's tough because it's like, man, I almost had it, or they're straining towards lockout, and then the weight comes back down, and then they fail the lift. And for me personally, not just from a psychological perspective, but also a physical and physiological perspective, I like to think that our bodies get the most benefit from all the lifts that we complete successfully. It's not always a good idea just to smash yourself into the ground and miss lifts all the time. Every once in a while, that's okay. Sometimes the training session calls for like really going up to an all-out max and going to complete failure. But for the most part, that's not really the case. Don't miss lifts in the gym. Leave every workout feeling better than when you went in. Now, this is kind of going off on a tangent here about training to failure. There are 3 types of training to failure. There is technical failure. So technical failure really is just the point at which you can no longer maintain proper form and technique. Sure, maybe you could lift the weight from A to B, but that doesn't mean that you're doing it well. And if you start to lose too much of that technical ability, you do kind of run into some risks or increasing your overall risk of injury. Now, the second type of training to failure is training to intentional failure. So, intentional failure would be when you can no longer match the intention of that workout or of that exercise. And a perfect example is dynamic effort training. If you guys have watched my video on YouTube all about dynamic effort training, I break down all the benefits on why grapplers need that to be baked into their workout programs to help them build speed and explosive power. But one of the key components of dynamic effort training is moving fast and explosive and as violently and as aggressive as possible. So when you're doing, say, a speed bench press on a dynamic effort workout day, every single rep should be fast. Every single rep should look almost as fast as throwing a punch. That's how fast it should be. So even though if you added more and more weight and the bar gets heavier and heavier, even though you could still lift it totally fine, it's not like you're going to fail because it's too heavy. You're not moving it fast enough, and you have surpassed the point of intentional failure. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the point of failure where you can no longer perform the exercise or the rep with proper form and technique. That's hitting technical failure. Then we have intentional failure, where maybe you do have perfect form and technique, but it's just not matching the intention of what we're doing in the workout. And then the third and final type of training to failure is what most of us are familiar with, which is complete all-out muscular failure, where your muscles cannot contract hard enough, your nervous system cannot engage enough motor units and put enough juice into your body to complete that rep. Now, I'm a big fan of training to failure in every single workout, but only to technical failure and intentional failure. So with every workout, I'm trying to, flirt with the edge of meeting technical failure, flirt with the edge of meeting intentional failure. Very rarely will I go to the point of complete muscular failure, mainly because it just puts a huge toll on the body and it can be very difficult to recover from. And when we think about what we're looking for in these training sessions, we want to chase progress. We don't necessarily want to keep chasing soreness or just completely banging ourselves up for no good reason. We want to chase progress. And I found that you can still make tons and tons of progress by training up to the point of technical and intentional failure, and very rarely, and only on rare occasions, hitting complete muscular failure. And that kind of summarizes that first big mistake that I see grapplers make, is that their passion to lift heavy and roll hard kind of bites them in the butt a little bit, where they're not necessarily chasing progress. They're just chasing this feeling of being really sore after a great workout. And if you need help kind of like dialing your training sessions back, it's a good idea just to follow a structured training program, a well-constructed training program that kind of puts some guardrails on you to not veer off and go too crazy with any of those workouts. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this podcast episode. But that kind of brings me to mistake number 2, which I've talked about a lot over the last 10 episodes of this podcast, and that's training like anyone else except a grappling athlete. One of the most difficult things about training for specific sports, whether it's Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, MMA, even non-combat sports like soccer, football, whatever, is that there's stuff from the strength and conditioning world that is great for building general physical preparedness, general strength, general conditioning. general explosive ability. And we should definitely, as athletes, regardless of what sport you're in, a lot of your training should build some of those general athletic qualities. That should kind of lay the foundation of your training. From there, once you start building on that foundation, you want it to be more and more specific to the physical demands of your sport. And a lot of people do a great job of building general strength training to some extent, but they really make the mistake of not honing in on the specific part, or the sport-specific physical preparedness. I said most people, but now that I think about it, I take that back. I'd say it's probably 50-50. Some people go so far into sport-specific training that they miss out on all of the benefits of general physical preparedness. Some people kind of get the benefits of general physical preparedness and then completely miss the sport-specific stuff. And what I'm really talking about is the mistake I see is grapplers following training programs that aren't designed to meet the physical demands of grappling. They might follow a bodybuilding program. They might follow a powerlifting program or a football training program, or they might find some quote-unquote athletic training program online that is like a bunch of ladder drills and cone drills and running routes and stuff like that. And that stuff is cool. Like, there's a benefit to doing that in other sports, but definitely not jiu-jitsu. And unfortunately, I think, how should I word this? I think sometimes people look at what some of the top performing grappling athletes are doing with their workouts and assuming that that is what they should be doing. I talked about this in the last podcast about looking at what the pros are currently doing and assuming that that's what we should be doing as hobbyists or people who aren't professional athletes. And that even goes into strength and conditioning. Even though there are some top athletes that are really big on just doing bodybuilding workouts, that doesn't really mean that bodybuilding style training is going to be the most appropriate thing to help you be physically prepared for all the physical demands that you're going to experience as a grappler. That's also not to say that like you can't get any value out of bodybuilding. I'll be the first person to say that I think bodybuilding has tons of value for grappling athletes, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you do. If you see that Gordon Ryan is only doing bodybuilding workouts, it's obviously working for him, but I would argue that that is the exception, not the rule for everybody else. You got to make sure that you're training like a grappling athlete. There are so many different things that go into grappling sports. You got to have a high amount of mobility and flexibility. You have to have pretty good conditioning. You got to have great concentric and isometric strength. You have to have a high blood lactate threshold. Even though Jiu-Jitsu is not the most explosive sport in the world, you do need to possess a decent amount of explosiveness for the times where you do need to be explosive. You don't want to be caught empty-handed, or you don't want to be caught unprepared when you need to scramble to a dominant position, or you need to be explosive to finish through on a takedown, and you don't have any of that explosive ability. And so just keep in mind that it's important that you train like a grappling athlete. That doesn't mean that you have to do Turkish get-ups and weighted hip escapes and all that other stupid stuff, but it does mean that you want to take a look at your training program, make sure it's designed with the context of being a grappling athlete. And if you need help with that, I've talked about it before on this podcast, I have a 100% free Grappler Accelerator training program. There's over, I think at this point, now that the podcast has been growing and the listeners have been following that program, I think there's over 1,200 people following that training program right now, or at least that have downloaded it. Some people have finished it already. And the results have been spectacular. People are using it for competition. Some people are using it just to help kind of kickstart their grappling athleticism. So if you want to learn more information on that, strengthmatrix.com/grappler or thestrengthmatrix.com/grappler. You can check it out. But all that to say, you want to make sure that your training and your workouts in the gym are kind of focused a little bit more towards on the side of preparing you to be a grappling athlete. Now, the third mistake that I see grappling athletes make fairly often is skipping warm-ups and their mobility work. And I see this happen both in the gym and on the mat. Warm-ups are I mean, I understand why people say warm-ups are a waste of time, but I also think that is doing a disservice to warm-ups themselves. I think some people make these overcomplicated warm-ups that take forever, and if you only have 60 minutes to work out, you end up spending 50 of those minutes just warming up. I do think that's a little bit silly. I think that's a little you're kind of overcooking the warm-up a little bit. But that's not to say that you should just go into training cold all the time, because the warm-up, the main benefit of the warm-up is to prepare you for the work that you're about to do. Whether that's in the gym, whether that's on the mat, warm-ups are still very, very important. And so I see that most of the I can't say that every grappler that gets injured skips warm-ups, but I will just say anecdotally, as a trend, I have found that the people that skip warm-ups the most also tend to get injured more often than some of the grapplers I know who do proper warm-ups. And that when I say a proper warm-up, that doesn't mean that you have to do, line drills of hip escapes and tons of burpees and basically do a CrossFit workout before your jiu-jitsu training should start. That doesn't mean that you have to do 45 minutes of stretching before you go squat. It just means that you should do whatever you need to do to be physically prepared for the work at hand. So for myself, when I go to the gym and I warm up, my warm up is pretty much the same regardless of what training session I'm doing. If I'm doing max effort work, if I'm doing dynamic effort work, if I'm just going in, doing some jacked and tan exercises to build muscle and all that good stuff, my warm up, for the most part, looks pretty similar. Usually starts with me doing some form of myofascial release work or rolling out on a foam roller. Some people find that rolling out on a foam roller isn't helpful for them as part of their warm-up, and if that's you, then that's totally okay. Just find what is helpful, and if you don't know where to start, follow a training program that has a structured warm-up and try that. So for me, it always starts with doing some form of myofascial release work. Then there's this other thing that I do called reflexive performance reset. It's basically like hitting, they're not pressure points, but you're rubbing these different spots on your body to kind of stimulate some, I don't want to get the terminology wrong because I'm still learning about all this stuff, but you're stimulating your nervous system in a way by rubbing these specific spots on your body where, to my understanding, the fascial lines where they all integrate, by hitting some of these different spots, you can kind of further stimulate other areas of your body. That's not to say that you're, quote unquote, turning on your glutes or you're turning on your rear delts, because none of those things are necessarily being turned on and off like a light switch. If they were turned off, you'd be in a casket. But you do want to be able to kind of improve the signaling from your brain to some of those other areas. So I've gotten tons of value out of doing the reflexive performance reset wake-up drills. So I'll do some of those, and then I just go into aspects of the main exercises that I'm doing. So if I'm squatting, that's a lot of lower body stuff. So I'll do some form of like ATG split squat or a bodyweight Bulgarian split squat, something that works through a pretty large range of motion that's going to be engaging the muscles that I'm going to be using in my main movements, which would be my quads, hamstrings, adductors, glutes, low back. And I usually do about 2 exercises for the lower body. And then if it's an upper body session, I usually do 2 or 3 exercises for the upper body. And the way I like to think of my warm-ups is once I do the mobility work, do the wake-up drills, and then get into those 2 to 4 exercises, I want the exercises to be difficult enough to where I get a little bit of a pump, but they shouldn't be so difficult that I'm having to strain or feel like a crazy burn through the warm-up. I still want to save some of the energy for the main movements that I'm going to do next, but I don't want to, just kind of be lazy in the warm-up. I think that's also a mistake that people make with the warm-ups, is that they aren't intentional and they don't focus during their warm-ups. They're kind of just messing around and their mind's kind of off doing something else, and then they show up to their main exercise and they're like, oh geez, I feel like I got to take a whole bunch of warm-up sets because now the workout's starting. Instead of, you show up to the gym, maybe you take some time foam rolling to kind of like clear out your head, you're listening to a podcast or whatever. But once you start, those RPR wake up drills, or at least for me, once I start those RPR wake up drills, once I start those 2 to 3 lower body movements, those 2 to 3 upper body movements, it's game time. I'm locked in. I'm focused up. I got Metallica playing. I got Tupac on the aux cord, and I'm ready to go. So take your warm-up seriously, and that also goes for your warm-ups on the mat. I think it's a disservice to say that jiu-jitsu warm-ups are stupid, or that jiu-jitsu is the only warm-up you need. I just don't agree with that. I think when people say like, oh, I just roll to warm up, I think that there's definitely value in integrating some form of rolling into your warm-up, but one of the main benefits of the warm-up is that you are kind of exposing your body, or you have an opportunity to expose your body to different things that can help better prepare you for the task at hand than the task itself. So what do I mean by that? I mean, when I was wrestling, our warm-ups were pretty long, and you probably don't have to use that exact warm-up that we did in wrestling for your jiu-jitsu warm-up. But one of the things that I liked most about the warm-ups was that we did a ton of gymnastic stuff. We did a ton of calisthenics, and we even did like these little, constraint-based games, if you will, as part of our wrestling warm-up. And what that did was that gradually helped us improve our general physical preparedness for wrestling. So just being able to do some cartwheels, some front handsprings, which I could never do, back handsprings, which I could never do, handstand walks, I crushed handstand walks, forward rolls, diving rolls, backward rolls, wheelbarrow carries. What else would we do? We would do like different types of partner carries and stuff like that. Like it's all fun. Like we're all just having a good time. But all of those exercises and all of the things that we did not only helped us warm up from the sense that, okay, we're getting our heart rate up, or raising our internal body temperature, we're kind of moving through all these different movement patterns to help our body be prepared to move into all the different movement patterns that we might get into while we're actually wrestling. But it's a great way to just build some capacity to better handle the stressors of wrestling. And I think that's where jiu-jitsu kind of struggles, where one side I see the argument for people saying warm-ups are stupid, line drills are stupid. If you have to do a 20-minute CrossFit workout to warm up from jiu-jitsu, you should leave that gym because you're wasting your money. I totally understand where people are coming from with that mindset. I also think that the opposite of that, where you're doing all that stuff, I agree. Like a lot of that stuff is pretty lame, but I do think there is still some benefit from that. So all that to say, when it comes to what your warm-up should be for jiu-jitsu, I think you should just do whatever you need to do to step onto the mat and feel your absolute best. So for me personally, I really like running in a circle at the start of practice. I personally get a lot of benefit out of doing skips and forward rolls, and I still can't do a front handspring or a back handspring, but if I could, I would, right? I get a lot of benefit out of that because I like I just like that I can do those things in the air against, or not against, a resisting opponent. So that way I can really get my body warmed up and ready and kind of like greased, if you will, before I start to do and engage in some of those movement patterns against a resisting opponent. That's what works best for me. I know some people that their preferred form of warming up, actually there's a guy that I train with, I love training with him, Graham, Barefoot Sprinter on Instagram. I see him in the parking lot before every jiu-jitsu session. He brings a kettlebell and he brings a mace club. And he's in the parking lot doing those mace swings. He's swinging a kettlebell around, doing some presses and things like that. And for him, he's found that that's what his body needs to be ready for hard grappling training. And I think that's great. So all that to say, take some time to figure out what works best for you to get your body prepared for the task at hand. You don't want to go from 0 to 100 because that's pretty risky in my opinion. That's where most people tend to get injured, is that they're not physically prepared for the stressors that they're going to experience on the mat. And, that's where injuries happen a lot of the times. The way I like to think of it is instead of just stepping onto the mat cold and just rolling around, I think of that approach as going from 0 to 60. In my mind, I would rather kind of ramp up to 30 and then hit it and then go from 30 all the way up to 100 miles an hour. I'm not a gearhead. I'm not a car guy, so I don't even know if that's exactly how it works. But in my mind, the warm up helps you instead of going from 0 to 60, you kind of warm up a little bit, then you go from 30 to 100 miles an hour. Next mistake that I could probably talk about for an entire episode, and maybe I will. Maybe I'll get some people on the podcast that are more educated in this area than myself. But mistake number 4 is going to be ignoring proper recovery and rehab protocols. It's almost like a meme at this point of all the Reddit threads where someone says, I got caught in a heel hook and I shredded my knee. What exercises should I do for recovery? It's like, bro, you are asking the wrong crowd. Like, if there's any group of people that the majority just give awful injury rehab advice, it's jiu-jitsu guys and wrestlers. Wrestlers, I think, are a little bit different because wrestlers, I think, don't even, most of the time, hardly even acknowledge that they're injured. Their arm could be falling off. They're like, no, coach, I'm good. Put me in, coach. Put me in. I want to bang. Let me bang, bro. For those of you that have been fans of the UFC for a long time and have watched The Ultimate Fighter, you guys know what I'm talking about when I say, let me bang, bro. But anyways, jiu-jitsu guys are notorious for getting some catastrophic injury, not addressing it, and then going on Reddit and saying like, hey, has anyone else had this injury? What should I do? And you have all these unqualified people chirping at the guy who just got injured saying, oh, you should do an ice bath. You should do knees over toes. You should do this. You should do that. They basically suggest everything under the sun except getting looked at by an actual physical therapist or someone who's an expert on dealing with these kinds of injuries. And that can be a huge downfall for any grappling athlete. Grappling, whether you're wrestling, whether you're doing jiu-jitsu, judo, any sambo, any form of grappling, it's a combat sport. Injuries are going to happen. I don't know anyone who's grappled for any significant amount of time who hasn't been injured. Every single person I train with has been injured. Every single person, every seminar that I've went to, all the seminar people have been injured. Everyone gets injured. The extent at which you get injured and the duration of time that you spend being injured and the severity of that injury all comes down to the responsibility that you're going to take. I've talked about it in the last podcast where the easiest way to decrease your risk of injury is just to tap early and to tap often. Like, don't try to be a hero. Don't try to grit out some heel hook. Don't try to grit out some Kimura. Like, if you can't escape, just tap. Don't wait till the very, very last second to tap. It's usually not going to work out too well for you. The other thing that's going to drastically decrease your risk of injury is getting stronger, which we've talked about a ton already. No one ever got injured because they were too strong. And the only reason why someone would get injured is because their body is not strong enough to withstand the forces being applied to them. Now that we got those two things out of the way, the next thing that you can do to better manage injuries as a grappling athlete is to really just don't be a dingus. You know, if you injure your knee, the peanut gallery on Reddit probably isn't going to be the best source of information. You know, anytime someone messages me on Instagram, and I honestly feel really bad for these guys because I've been injured before. I know what it's like to feel like your whole world is crashing down because you just got injured and you already know, like, man, I can hardly walk. I'm going to be out of jiu-jitsu for a couple months. That feeling sucks. And I empathize with anybody that's had a drastic injury where that's been the case, where someone falls on their knee, some freaking idiot jumps guard or some freaking dingus that doesn't know how to do scissor takedowns just jumps on someone's knee and completely obliterates it. Sometimes it's not even something like that. Sometimes it can just be as simple as, hey, I got caught in a scramble. I was rolling through on transitions. I don't even really know what happened, but felt something kind of pull in my shoulder and it just hasn't been right since. And I really empathize with those people because when you get injured, it absolutely sucks. However, when people message me on Instagram and ask me about, hey, this is the injury, this is what happened, what exercises should I do? 99 times out of 100, I say, hey man, I appreciate you reaching out, but you should really go get it looked at with someone that can assess you in person. It's often better to get some expert consultation on that who can really assess the severity of that injury and help give you a little bit more informed guidance on how to rehab that injury. It's also important to recognize that not every physical therapist understands jiu-jitsu. Not every physical therapist gets it, so to speak. So they may tell you something like, well, this happened at jiu-jitsu. My advice would be to never do jiu-jitsu again. And no one wants to hear that. And if that's what your physical therapist says, guess what? You probably need to go find another physical therapist. And it's probably going to take some work to find someone that's going to work really well with you and give you some good advice that is more than just don't do this ever again. One person that I'm a big fan of is Mike Pekarsky, or Dr. Kickass on Instagram. He has some amazing content on combat sport injuries. He has some courses for physical therapists who want to be more involved with jiu-jitsu and better understand kind of the physical demands of jiu-jitsu in the context of injuries and how to properly progress and rehab injuries. I would definitely check him out. And one thing that's like just kind of hilarious at this point is like he's a black belt. Like he totally understands jiu-jitsu and he's a physical therapist. So if there's anybody who would be most qualified to talk about this stuff, it's going to be him. And yet people still just go to Reddit and they just say like, hey, here, every random person on Reddit, how do I fix this injury? So all that being said, my opinion, it's a big mistake if you're not seeking out experts. It's a big mistake if you're not doing what's necessary to properly rehab that injury. For me, with my injury, especially with my neck, I did have to consult with a lot of different experts. I was reaching out on Instagram. I was talking to different people. I was doing all of that while also doing the hardest part, which was not training jiu-jitsu, or at least significantly changing how I was training to make sure the injury didn't get worse. And so regardless of what injury you have, if it's a knee injury, a neck injury, whatever the case may be, take the time to rehab that thing properly. You don't want it to turn into something that constantly bothers you for the rest of your jiu-jitsu career. And in addition to that, seek out people who are actual experts who can help you get back to the mat, who can help you rehab that injury properly and make sure that you're set up and ready to go to continue lifting heavy and rolling hard. Next mistake that I see grapplers make, fifth and final mistake, is random workouts with no plan or trying to do everything. I think what's so cool about social media today is that now more than ever, we have access to all these different people and all these different thought leaders who can give us information on how to get stronger, how to improve our conditioning, how to get better mobility, how to be more explosive. Like there's so much great information out there. However, that also comes with the problem of information overload. And there are going to be two camps on either side. There are going to be people that think the best way to get strong is to lift light weights really, really slow. There are going to be people who think the best way to get strong is to do a bunch of goofy exercises like the Turkish get-up. There's going to be, and that's just my opinion, just kind of dogging on them a little bit. There's also people that think like, hey, the best way to get strong, squat, bench, deadlift, that's it. So there's all these different camps. And I would say more often than not, every camp is right to some extent. For some person that genuinely believes that the Turkish get-up is a great exercise for making you stronger at jiu-jitsu, there are probably cases where they're right, where, yeah, actually the Turkish get-up might be an appropriate exercise for that person and their training goals. However, there may be someone like myself that looks at that and says like, you know what, I just don't see it. I just don't agree with it. I think there's a much better way to do it. And that unfortunately leaves people in the middle having to balance, like, well, who do I listen to? The one person says this, one person says the exact opposite. And what I would suggest is just finding something and sticking to it. Test it out. You're going to have to take ownership over your own training to see what really works for you. And you may make some mistakes along the way, and that's okay. It may be kind of clunky. It may be a little messy. You can almost think of this as jiu-jitsu. There are some people that say, hey, in jiu-jitsu, you need to, focus on the fundamentals, only focus on, basic smash pass, basic leg drag pass, basic armbar, basic, cross collar choke, basic, whatever the case may be. Then there are other people that are much more, creative, so to speak, and say, hey, you don't have to do just the basics. You can do all this other stuff. And it may feel like that they're contradicting each other, and you might feel like you're stuck in the middle saying, okay, who's right? This person over here or this person over here? And at the end of the day, just like jiu-jitsu, you just got to pick something. Just pick something and try it out. When people message me on Instagram or leave comments on YouTube and they're asking like, hey, coach, what do you think about this? Should I do 8 to 12 reps in my workouts? I almost all the time say, go for it. Like, try it out. Let me know how it works. And over time, you'll end up finding what works best for you. And if you're doing all these different random workouts, and that's the mistake I see, is all these random workouts where you pull a couple exercises from this influencer, you pull a couple exercises from this influencer, and then you follow that for, a week, maybe 2 weeks, but then you watch this podcast with someone else and you're like, oh, I'm going to change everything and do all the stuff that they're talking about. It's really hard to find out what works if you don't give it enough time to really make adaptations from that. I think doing squat, bench, deadlift is fantastic. I don't think it's fantastic for everybody, but for some individuals, it could be great. If you only do squat, bench, deadlift for 2 weeks and then you jump over and you only do kettlebells, it's really hard to know if squat, bench, deadlift was going to work out for you or not because you only did it for 2 weeks. If you only do kettlebells for 2 weeks and then you switch over to landmine stuff, it's like, well, the kettlebells were on their way to providing some benefit, but you didn't stick with it long enough to really reap the rewards of that style of training. And that's honestly kind of why I called my website and my training app the Strength Matrix, is because, like, in the Matrix, when Neo he gets plugged in and they start uploading all those training programs and he's like, I know Kung Fu. And, he's learning all that stuff. By the end of the movie, when he really becomes the one, he's no longer looking at the agents in the hallway. All he sees is code. And then, the movie's almost 30 years old at this point, so this is not spoilers or anything, but he ends up, taking out the agents, then he can really start tweaking everything in the Matrix to where he can start flying and doing all that crazy stuff. That's how I look at strength training. It's like, once you can get to the point where you can see the pros and cons of each exercise, see the pros and cons of each style of training, from there, you can really start to play with all these different levers. You can start pulling down this lever over here for hypertrophy in this scenario. Then when you need to focus more on conditioning, you can pull down this lever, and you can really start to becoming a master over your own training. You can almost be like Dr. Dre. If you've ever seen those videos of Dr. Dre in the booth with Eminem, he has that big switcher board and he's like pushing up all these dials and like turning these knobs and all that stuff, and he's creating like a symphony of music. And I think training is very similar, where you can learn all these different things, you test things out for a period of time, 2 to 3 months, check back on your progress, see how it worked, take what was useful and get rid of what wasn't useful, kind of like what Bruce Lee talks about. Hey, real quick, I wanted to pause the podcast and tell you about the Strength Matrix training app and our free training program called Grappler Accelerator. This is a complete training program that covers all of your needs to help you get started on becoming the best grappling athlete that you can be. Everything from a full strength and conditioning training program, a simple and clean diet guide, recovery protocols, a super sleep toolkit, and a bunch of other dope stuff to help you lift heavy and roll hard. There's already over 1,000 grapplers that have downloaded this training program and gotten started on enhancing their grappling athleticism, and you can be the next. To download this training program today, just go to thestrengthmatrix.com/grappler or click the link in the description below. Now, back to the podcast. So that covers the main 5 mistakes that I see grappling athletes make in the gym. Biggest mistake right from the jump is chasing soreness instead of chasing progression. Instead, remember, make sure that your workouts are designed to stimulate positive progress, but not completely annihilate your body. Mistake number 2, doing training that isn't specific to the physical demands of grappling. There's a lot of benefit to doing general strength training and training for general fitness, but if you really want to be the best grappling athlete possible, you got to train specific to the physical demands of our sport. And that's where we're always talking about lifting heavy and rolling hard. It's not just lifting heavy for the sake of rolling heavy. It's lifting heavy so that way we can roll hard. Mistake number 3 is skipping your warm-ups and your mobility work. I didn't talk a ton about mobility work, but it kind of gets baked into the warm-ups. You can get away with mobility training just being mixed into your overall strength training, but if you still have mobility restrictions, you may need to dedicate a little bit more time to improve your mobility for the sake of jiu-jitsu, or improve your mobility for the different positions that you're going to get into at jiu-jitsu. Mistake number 4, you got to make sure you're recovering. Don't ignore the proper recovery protocols. Don't ignore the proper rehab protocols. And if you need to, reach out to some experts who can help you out. And then mistake number 5, following random workouts or trying to do everything. You just got to pick something, stick with it for a couple months, see what worked, keep what worked, get rid of what didn't. Before we sign off for today, I did want to give a couple shout outs. The Lift Heavy Roll Hard Grappling Club is growing really, really fast, and I'm super fired up. I'm super excited. We are so close to 40,000 subscribers on YouTube. So thank you guys so much. Every single one of you that has shared the podcast, that is texting your favorite lifting partner, that's texting your favorite grappling partner and putting them on game, I salute you. For those about to roll hard, I salute you. For those about to lift heavy, I salute you. All that being said, did want to give a couple shout outs on some comments that people had from last week's episode. We got a comment from Av Rats. He says, every time I start jiu-jitsu, particularly now when I'm almost 40, I get burnt out and all those little micro injuries, and I question why I started this in the first place and end up not sticking it out. Man, dude, that sucks. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Like, I'm sorry to hear that. That sucks. What it sounds like to me, and you know, this is just based off of your comment, what it sounds like to me is that when you start jiu-jitsu, you go a little too hard, a little too early. What I would suggest for you instead is try to take a little bit more gradual approach. That way you're not kind of dumping in too much intensity into your training week more than what you're able to handle currently. And then the other thing that you can do is just try to get stronger, try to improve your general physical preparedness, try to improve your work capacity. The Foundations program that's currently in our Strength Matrix training app is designed to help you do exactly that. It's designed to help you build a huge base of strength, stimulate tons of muscle growth, and enhance your conditioning to a point where you're really building out that engine and really building out your work capacity. So hope that helps for you. More power to you, man. Hope to see you back on the mat soon. Next thing from, this isn't really a question. I just put this in here because it was a nice compliment and it made me feel good. But this is from Alex_997 on one of my videos about kettlebell exercises. He said, pretty sure he uses steroids. I was like, yeah, man, I'll take that. I'm not taking any gear right now, and I haven't taken any gear. But, you know, Alex, thank you. That made me feel good. It put a smile on my face. And then another kind of question, more like an interesting comment about soreness that I thought would be good to address is, this is from @ohno837. on one of my videos about how to deal with soreness as a grappling athlete. He said, "This is stupid. Soreness only comes from eccentric lifting, which is not necessary. Soreness means your body has been weakened." So, a couple things in there that we should unpack. Soreness does tend to happen more often when you do heavy eccentric focused lifting. So, the eccentric portion of an exercise or of a movement is when the muscle is lengthening under load. So when you think about doing a bicep curl, right? When you curl the weight upwards, that is called the concentric because you're contracting. When you're holding the weight at any joint angle, that's called isometric. You're not moving. That's an isometric contraction. When you're lowering the weight or the bicep is lengthening in that curl, that is the eccentric portion of the lift. Now, when you look at eccentric, or the eccentric, the isometric, and the concentric, for the most part, the eccentric portion of the exercise or lengthening under load does tend to cause a lot more muscle damage and promote a lot more soreness when compared to just concentric and isometric. So if you're, and this is great to know because if you're prepping for a jiu-jitsu competition or a wrestling tournament and you don't necessarily want to take time off in the gym because you're competing so often, but you also don't want to be super sore when you go compete, you can focus most of your exercises to be concentric only or isometric only, and you're going to have a significantly less muscle damage and significantly less soreness following that workout. So when I help grappling athletes, competitors, peak for competition, we actually do a lot of that stuff like concentric only deadlifts or pushing a sled or using something like sled rows or concentric only types of exercises for the upper body because it doesn't create as much soreness. Same thing with different types of isometrics. Now, that's not to say that if you did a ton of those things, you'll never get sore. So to think that soreness only comes from eccentric lifting, I just haven't seen that to be the case. Eccentric lifting definitely promotes a lot more soreness, but that's not to say that that's the only way you're going to get sore. You can definitely experience some soreness following tons and tons and tons of isometrics and tons and tons and tons of concentric only movements. The other thing that was mentioned in the comment is that eccentric lifting is not necessary. And that's just something I completely disagree with. Eccentric lifting is necessary. It's important that you still develop eccentric strength as a grappling athlete. The greater your eccentric strength, the greater your ability to absorb force. I may do a full episode on triphasic training, and hopefully someday we can interview Cal Dietz, who is the originator and, in my opinion, the genius behind triphasic training. But what triphasic training is, in the most simplest terms, is segmenting aspects of your training program to focus on each of those three phases. So you have a portion of your training program that focuses on improving your overall eccentric strength, or there's a heavy emphasis on the eccentric because you're improving your ability to absorb force. When you improve your ability to absorb force, you also have the byproduct of improving your ability to produce force. Your body can only produce as much force as it can successfully absorb. So when you think about, squatting, if you have a heavy bar on your back, but you can't lower yourself into the bottom position with control and absorb that force properly, it's going to be really difficult to produce an equal or greater amount of force to stand up with that weight. So all that being said, eccentric lifting or eccentric training, so to speak, and developing eccentric strength is very important for grappling athletes. Improving your ability to absorb force not only has the byproduct of helping you produce more force and being stronger, but the more force that you can absorb properly and safely, the less likely you are to get injured. So it's not that it's unnecessary, it's just that there is a time and place for when you need to do eccentric focused training or include that as part of your training program. And for me personally, with the athletes I coach, I typically have them do a lot of eccentrics in their off season and or their preseason. When they're in season or in competition, we don't do as much eccentric focused lifting, mainly because it causes a lot of soreness and we want to try to limit some of that soreness, but we don't avoid it altogether. And then the last thing they said was soreness means your body has been weakened, and that's just part of the training adaptation. Remember the SRA curve: stimulus, recovery, adaptation. When we induce or put our body under a training stimulus, yeah, it's going to be weaker immediately following that training stimulus. And so we want to make sure that we provide our body with enough time to successfully recover from that, so that way we can make those positive training adaptations. And that's it. That's it for this episode of the Settlage Strength Podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. Let's keep growing the Lift Heavy, Roll Hard Grappling Club. We're almost to 40,000 subscribers. Maybe we'll do some like celebration or something cool when we hit 40K subscribers on YouTube. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that would be to share this episode with your favorite training partners, or even training partners you don't like, training partners that aren't your favorite. But share this episode with your favorite partner to lift heavy with. Share this episode with your favorite training partner to roll hard with. And I'll catch you guys later. Lift heavy, roll hard. Peace.